Can we pick up on this issue, and anybody can contribute, on this techno-optimism that you have and how that links to the ability of governments to make rules about procurement and full cost pricing and that little loop of conversation? You know, is there, because not everyone would, you know, the world is really split about whether technology is going to provide a solution to the future. It's quite a painful conversation. We're often in quite different camps about it. I'm wondering whether there's a way to understand that proposition more usefully. Göran, would you start, and then others may join in?
Right.
Don't hold back, gentlemen.
Okay, no, we won't. I think they're essentially asking two different questions. Let me start with a techno-optimistic one. We tend to hear very frequently that nature is very good at what it does. And yes, it is. It functions. It's a state, it's a system in equilibrium. There's nothing that says that it's the best possible equilibrium. It's just one that we ended up in. No? The evolution just created things that worked. They didn't create the best thing. So one of the things we're able to do now, for example, is create better things. We can take a bacteria that does wonderful things and make it even better. So we can create something that didn't exist before. I can take a bacteria, I can put some DNA in it, which I now can read, and I create a bacteria that uses sunlight to drive itself, so it doesn't require any energy. It then absorbs from the air carbon dioxide. It then processes this carbon dioxide and releases oxygen into the air, and then it turns out some nice little sugar or whatever it is we want in the other end, simplistically expressed. So our ability to improve on nature, so it's not mimicry, it's improvement, enables us to do things we didn't do and to capture things. I can have bacteria that can go through the soil and absorb exactly the mineral atoms I want and come back up, and I can do these things, which means that although it takes longer time today, it's a little bit more expensive today, won't be tomorrow, I can actually have a mind that absorbs anything I want by design, and I don't need to dig those big holes because I just use it anywhere. That is one of the futures we look at in bioengineering in these scenarios. So that is one of the techno-optimistic views of the world. And it's one view. It's not the only view, but it's one view. Procurement is another one with completely different issues around using procurement to drive things by asking for things that don't exist. So you write a specification for something that's 10% above what is possible, and that forces somebody to innovate, and that drives capability. There's a different things by writing a specification for something that does exist, that drives no renewal.
Can I just extend that, though, that conversation, and invite the others into it? That's difficult when it seems like the general population wants governments to buy at the lowest cost. You know, there's a lot of scrutiny in government spending, and let's talk generally. We don't have to get too granular about South Australia because we're having a broad conversation, but I think there's a pressure from the people to buy at the lowest price, or certainly a pressure that many politicians in the world... Someone want to talk to me about that?
I do. I mean, you know, it's a story that's told about John Glenn when he was just blasting off on his maiden voyage into outer space, asked what he thought about, and his answer was that what I'm writing in was built by the lowest government bidder. And I think it kind of underscored the very point that Göran has just kind of made clear, and that is on the aluminum purchases, you can find things that are the cheapest. What you need to do is look more holistically, full cost accounting, to be able to look at all elements of it, and I think that was implicit in what's said. But I think this is one of the areas that I think we can allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And I think that what we need to be able to do is also to be able to make real progress. The idea of always challenging to be able to go better, I think, is exactly right. But to get to perfection, we ought not to sacrifice the additional steps we can take today. We're not going to, in my view, remake the sprawling nature of Adelaide. It's not going to change, but we can make sure that the new investments, the new things that are happening, are in a much smarter, better way of being able to do things. And that list goes on, not just here in Adelaide, but across the world.
Herbie?
Yeah, I'd say that in the discussion on technology, you know, there's a nice saying that technology is the answer, but what was the question? So I think we really need to start with that consideration. And I think certainly so far we've had major problems arising out of unconsidered uses of technology. I mean, when the steam engine first came along, the smoke that came out of the chimney was not really an issue. It was only a few steam engines in a few places, but now the world is one big steam engine, to kind of speak metaphorically. And at one point in this context is say that by and large our current systems that we use in manufacturing and in production and so on are basically production systems, whereas nature is a reproduction system. And we are constantly disrupting natural cycles through our linear production systems, where we take resources and pump out waste into nature in ways that nature cannot beneficially digest any longer. So certainly I would agree with you that we have reason to be technically optimistic, but we need the full systems analysis. I mean, renewable energy is a very interesting example of a very major step forward through technology. There are still downsides there too. I mean, people have been concerned about wind farms slashing and killing birds and other effects. People have even said that offshore wind farms disturb the migration patterns of whales and so on. So certainly there's the urgent need to always be very, very holistic in our understanding of these matters. And that certainly, I think, needs to be an essential part of the way we go forward with the uses of technology.
Thank you. I'll just pick up that issue since there's nobody at the mic, but I'm going to encourage you again. Please do come. We'd love to have a question. I'd love to have a question from you. Premier Rann, I want to talk about the carbon question that we're dealing with and the carbon tax and the problem the whole world has had with dealing with this issue and the problem of agreement, really. And Fred, you raised that about, you were talking about that too. And I know that as a result of the work you did with Stephen Schneider, you got involved in that states coalition which you led. Can you tell us a little bit, and really this question now is about leadership and politics and agreement and ability to move at the international level, the national level and the state level. Can you tell us how that was?
Okay, I'll tell you a bit about that, but first of all, just reflecting on what was said before, back in 1975-76, the Dunstan government brought in container deposit legislation. They got it actually from Portland, Oregon, just as we, in fact, if you look at the $2 billion that we're putting into electrifying the trains as well as the trams, I mean, Portland, Oregon has had a big impact on the state. At the time, when Dunstan announced it, it was going to be the end of civilization. You're going to see people going to be closing down factories, that people wouldn't, it would be the death of the beer industry, the wine industry, and everything else. It's interesting, 35 years later, no other state has got container deposit legislation, even though in this state it has seen much cleaner byways and highways. It's produced its own recycling industry. It helps Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and other people raise money, so it's an incredibly cyclical process. Just recently we increased it from 5 cents to 10 cents. It was the end of civilization again. I had people coming in, this was going to destroy the industry. And, you know, ultimately it's about biting the bullet. The plastic bag legislation that John Hill and I were involved in, you could not believe the lobbying that we got, that this was going to be, not only was it going to kill retail in this state, it was also going to be incredibly disruptive. The public would not like it, it wouldn't work. Well, we introduced it, it was completely seamless. And what did the opinion polls say? 90% support from South Australians because they actually feel proud about these things. So it gets back to those long-term issues. And Herbie played a major role in terms of our government's mindset, and so did Stephen Schneider. We have now got 54% of the nation's wind power, and we've 21% of our power in the state as of March of this year comes from renewables. So we hit the federal government's target 9 years ahead of schedule. And now we're going for a 33% target, and my view is that we will easily reach that target. But again, we have to constantly try to emphasise the importance of the long term, because thank God for Fred, because Fred told me when he convinced John and I and Pat Conlon to invest in trams, he said, you've got to remember that when you announce those trams, it's going to be the end of civilization. It'll be a white elephant. No one will use the trams. And then when you start digging up the streets, it'll be even worse. And people then spend mentally through the media the amount of money spent on the tram will be X number of hip replacements or whatever, and it'll be a white elephant. Then you say, well, actually we've doubled the funding for health in the past 9 years, so then it's get respent in another way. But when the trams open, Fred thankfully had told me this would happen. People would say, why can't we, they're overcrowded as opposed to being empty. So the important thing is to say, okay, let's go for the long term, and that's why we had a state strategic plan, and we have one which is about 10 years and 20 years ahead, and a 30-year plan for metropolitan Adelaide, and we get measured, unlike parliamentary statements and political promises in elections, you get measured every 2 years by an independent committee on the progress that you make against the plan. But it is interesting what we've just heard today, because most of these innovations, whenever they were announced or introduced, whether it was going to be banning smoking in pubs, all of those things were going to result in mass job losses, and we've now got the highest number of people in jobs in our state's history. In terms of, I guess, bringing what Göran's saying and Herbie's saying and also what Fred's saying together, I mean, the purchase of the Mitsubishi site down at Tonsley, and to turn that into the exemplar in the nation of green, clean, new industries, I think will be a big test for the future. And hopefully, like many of the other things that the thinkers have come up with, will be the template for other places as well.
Okay, thank you. We've got some questions here. Thanks very much. Please introduce yourself and then direct your question to who you'd like.
Hello, my name's Robert Lloyd. I work with the Australian Industry Group, but I'm not speaking on their behalf tonight. Why do you think we're not seeing strategic planning or visions put forward that actually capture the integrated long-term value? And I commend the state government for the work they've done in a 30-year strategy. But when we talk about urban renewal, we're talking in 7,500-year type time frames. We're talking about agriculture, and we're talking about many hundreds of years or thousands of years to maintain sustainability. Why do you think we haven't determined what that end game is? Why haven't we determined that 3-generation tree planting sustainability? You know, the Aboriginal people here have actually taught sustainability as part of their culture. We don't have it in their education system. So when do you think we're going to see a vision that's long-term, that business and government can actually follow, and what are those technologies and approaches?
Thank you. Who'd like to start with that? Herbie?
I think there's several answers, obviously, always. The first one would be that certainly in our higher education system in particularly, unless you specialize, you don't have a chance. I mean, I personally, I've specialized in being a generalist. And that, I think, this is something that, you know, very rarely get the opportunity to do. I mean, I was delighted to be invited to come here as Thinker in Residence, because it allowed me, and others who were working with me at the time, to spread out our minds into exactly the broad spectrum that you refer to. But by and large, this is a very rare opportunity. And I think you ought to be commended for allowing these opportunities for visitors to come here and to do this kind of thing. But certainly, you know, when you look around the world, there's only one city in the world that has thinkers in residence. This is actually Adelaide. I was looking on the web the other day. So certainly the opportunities for generalism are very rare, and I think that's one of the major reasons why we are in this trouble. I think in the past, people, when you talk about foresters, as you did a moment ago, by definition, if you lead that way of life, where you have a long-term perspective as the key component in which you operate, then of course it's much easier to be a generalist and to understand the interrelationship between a fungus and a tree root, and the opportunities for harvesting at the right time, and, you know, living from that and so on. By and large, we are being so forced into niches, into narrow passageways in our thinking, that is precisely the kind of problem that you refer to.
Fred, and then Göran, perhaps.
You know, it does seem to me that one of the things that is, I think, shifting is when you look at analyses, certainly that I've seen in the States, my guess is it's pretty parallel here. If you go back to the 1950s and ask, you know, how many jobs were ones that, in fact, all the things necessary to do the job that was that somebody was hired for were under that person's control, and the numbers are up in the upper 70% range. That is, that individuals at that period, you know, they kind of controlled whatever it is they were doing. Today, it is well below 50%. that are all under their authority, which is to say they have to work with others. They have to be able to be more integrated. They have to break down those silos. By the way, those people who defend silos, do refer to them as cylinders of excellence. Oh, that's right. Yeah. And there is a side of those cylinders. You want excellence. I want a brain surgeon to be in a cylinder of excellence. But it really is a fundamental shift. And I do think that the university systems have made some movement in this regard. That is, they are doing more interdisciplinary kind of degree programs, other sorts of things. I think a lot more has to be able to be done. But the ability to be able to teach how to be able to look at systems in a holistic way, I think has got a long ways to go, and I think is a very challenging and a very good question.
Göran.
I think you were asking a very good question, as we said, and I think the reason for that is that you're coming to the essence of a way of thinking. And there are a couple of issues here I'd like to raise. The first one has to do with something called the law of requisite variety, Ashby's law of requisite variety, which basically, if I am simplifying, says that the dynamics of the environment must be matched by the diversity of the team. So if you live in a completely linear world, you can have a team that has always made up of carbon copies of each other. It's going to be very efficient and work very well. But the more difficult and dynamic the world becomes, the more you have to have a team which is made up of people who have different perspectives. You can go home and look your option theory up and you will see why that is so. But what it means is that we have to welcome into the group of debate that underpins the decision people with a different viewpoint. And that leads to the second issue. That's a cultural issue. Mm-hmm. How we look at this? Are we comfortable with having people in the room who think differently than we do? Are we welcoming it? Or are we saying there is one truth only, and by the way, I have it? Okay. Mm-hmm. Is that the way we look at it? And I have come to see, when I come to Australia, that there are some domains in which you have the one truth syndrome. One of them, for example, is economics. You are the last standing bastions of fundamentalist, market-efficient, theoretical Talibans. Right? Whereas the rest of the world has kind of moved into behavioral economics and welcome different perspective of these type of things. And also your systems are set up like that. Again, I am not from an Anglo-Saxon background at all. I come more like a Germanic background in these things. And we have a more collaborative view. When we enter a room, our assumption is we will work together. When you enter a room, the assumption is I'm going to win and you're going to lose. Right? So there are cultural issues, and they then drive our systems. The constitution that you have in Australia is basically the Westminster system. The Westminster system has this issue about, opposition and government and the role of opposition, which to some extent has degenerated. You oppose anything that comes out, no matter whether it's relevant or not. But it is a confrontational system. Where I come from, I have a system, a different constitution. The constitution is that government, in other words, the ministers, they set strategic objectives. They are prohibited in law from telling you how they are to be achieved. If they do, they go to jail. Okay? And then there are separate agencies whose task is to deliver on the objectives with total freedom of how. And that means that you have a completely different dynamics on these things. For example, budget years don't really matter. This agency can keep the money or save it or spend it or borrow as long as they're over the long term are evening out. It also means that you can have people who have one view politically there, another view here, and that's okay. The minister appoints the guy who runs the agency, but he can't fire him. Be fired by 2/3 majority in Parliament. So it's a different type of dynamics in these things. And in a second, you have also this system where you have groups that are put together in advisory council representing universities and all this type of issues who you are listening to. You don't do what they tell you to, because they will always ask for their own thing to some extent. But you get the input and you get that going.
Look, I think that's terrific. It's interesting, there's been a bit of writing in recent weeks about how the Westminster system may be modified in terms of a broader embrace. And in a sense, because of circumstance. I mean, in 2002, when I was sworn in as Premier, we had a tied election, and Peter Lewis, who was somewhat eccentric, was our speaker. But what we did is we brought in, and that was for our own survival, we brought in Carleen Maywald, the leader of the National Party, and we brought in Rory McEwen, an independent Liberal, into the cabinet. But when we got the biggest majority we ever had, we kept them on. We didn't need to, because we had lots of enthusiastic new Labor people wanting to be cabinet ministers. And why did we keep them on? It's because they brought a different perspective into the cabinet processes, a regional and rural perspective, and probably more importantly, a completely different culture. And so I think that we were a much better government when we had Carleen and Rory inside the cabinet, because they did give us a different perspective. But the other thing is that we then, I got condemned, in fact, by one newspaper, it's quite a common occurrence actually, but anyway, was that we decided to say we had a chair of an economic development board, the economic development board that we appointed at the start, because we were regarded as a Rust Belt state and Rust Bucket state, all these things that were being said about us, had a prominent Liberal in Robert Champion de Crespigny as the chair, and people like Carolyn Hewson, but also Bob Hawke and others around the room. And we made sure that the head of the Economic Development Board, and it's still the case today, and also the chairman of the Social Inclusion Board, David Capo, sat in on the Executive Committee of Cabinet, which is the most senior committee of Cabinet, again, bringing a business perspective, a social justice perspective. And I remember reading this editorial that this broke every precedent going back to Charles I or something. Well, maybe it was time for a change. And also about the separation of church and state. So I think that we need to look as a country about bringing people into cabinets who may not be elected, but still have the same rigorous processes of facing question time, to fill gaps in the expertise, because no party no group has basically the sole accepted view on an issue.
Thank you. So you've been waiting for a long time. We'll take this question and then your question and then...
Yes, so my name's John McTeer. I'm retired, and when you become retired, you wonder whether you find the time to work. My question is, why has it taken so long to prove the fact that climate change is a fact?
Herbie will start that.
Because of vested interests, very simple. I think one doesn't have to say much more. I mean, basically, ever since the Industrial Revolution, the dependence of fossil fuels was what made the world go round, and still does today. I mean, look at the increase in the use of fossil fuels ever since the first steam engines were started, and this figure that I quoted earlier on about burning something like 2 million years of fossil fuels every year at this moment in time. The fact is we are all what one might call amplified people. We are amplified men and women in terms of the fact that you could say we don't really have feet any longer, they're wheels, and we don't have muscles, but they're motors, and all our functions in one way or another are amplified through those technologies. I remember reading when the steam engines were first introduced in Britain in the 19th century, the distance from which people got their marriage partners went up fourfold, from 10 to 40 kilometers. So fossil fuel use in transport was from that moment onwards built into social relations. And nowadays it's, there's a lot of long distance relationships now. The jumbo jet is now built into sex relationships between both men and women and men and so on and so forth, across the world. We are now globally linked through the daily use of fossil fuels, and every aspect of our lives is that. So of course it is in the interest of those who provide those fossil fuels, who provide the technology and so on, to make sure that this process continues. And so suddenly scaling back from that level of fossil fuel dependence is becoming a politically and economically systemic issue to an extent that I think is very, very difficult to undo. And so certainly that I think is the critical underlying issue, that climate deniers have been not only in the ascendancy for many years, but are still, despite all the knowledge that we now have, scientific knowledge, still not being silenced.
Just picking up on that issue I raised at the beginning, Premier Rann, what was it like for you as leader of that states group on climate change when the international work stalled so severely? Well,
this is the climate group, which has 72 states. So it's a subnational group, and the Premier of Quebec, Jean Charest, and I jointly chair it. And we were obviously, we'd met previously in Poznan and subsequently in Cancun. We met at the same time as the UN conference, but Copenhagen was a dismal failure by world leaders. In the meantime, the subnational leaders actually reached agreement on a whole range of things. And what we've been doing is stealing ideas from each other. It's best practice ideas. And I think that we've learnt from Canadian provinces. They have learnt from us. We're working very closely with Wales and Jane Davidson, who was the former minister there, Cohen Jones, who's the Premier, and the First Minister. And so, but we made a decision, for instance, that we're going to plant 1 billion trees. I put it up as a motion. It was very strongly supported by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And so far we're up to 350 million trees that have been committed. And the Premier of Quebec has committed 100 million trees. I think the First Minister of Scotland committed to planting 100 million trees. And so we wanted to just demonstrate, given that 60 to 80% of the decisions affecting the environment are actually made at the regional or provincial or state level, that the actual subnational governments can be leaders rather than followers, and that's certainly the case on renewables and climate change here in Australia.
We'll keep this short, but Göran, you could probably say something to us about what business has been doing about climate change in spite of the delays in the agreements. I mean, business has been roaring ahead into this space, haven't they?
Yeah, let me just make a quick set of comments. The first one is, we love to plant more trees in Sweden, we just don't have any space. That's the problem. They're full of trees already. The second one is that the greatest invention for mankind is probably the bicycle, because that allowed genetic diversity, which increased our IQ dramatically as a species. It's very important that, and actually wheels are not a bad thing from that point of view, and you can actually link a number of those progresses to that. The other is a quick response to the question around proof, and I think here is actually there is a methodological and very, very important distinction when one has to understand when one talks to scientists. There is a distinction between proven fact and probable things. So there are almost no scientists out there who will not agree to the statement that it is probable that we have climate change. But the difference between probable and proof may not matter to the genetic debate, but it does matter to a scientist. So, and the reason we can't prove it and brutal, although it all makes eminently sense that it is, I don't think it was there, is that it's a geological time perspective. Actually, if you wanted to go back, you can say that the average temperature today is about 2% lower than the average temperature during the Roman Empire. So the question is then, what does that mean? It's 0.5% lower than when we had the Vikings settling on Greenland and growing crops, which you can't do today. So the answer is, I'm sure we have climate change, but from a scientific, rigorous standpoint, it is very difficult to prove it as a generic issue. You can look at scenarios on it. So I think that's it. And if you want to have the way science should be executed, and I will be very brief, Kelly, is look at what happens on this claim that we may have broken the speed of light. A group of scientists did an experiment, found something anomaly. They repeated the experiment 60,000 times. Then they reviewed their findings with the assumption that they made an error, everything where. They couldn't find the error, they gathered all the data, they opened up to the world last Friday and said, you have a look at it. We can't find an error, but we assume there is one, so please come and look at it, and do repeat it and see if you can repeat it. That is how science should be done. Businesses has found that the green opportunities are huge. And again, I mentioned that Sweden before in the 1960s started this regulatory issue very, very early. And they have huge successful business that export technologies and issues in the green space because we were early. And I think that's critical. We also learned another thing, and that's the behavioral issue, which firms survive and which die. When a regulation came in like that, you have two reactions. One group of firms says, this is horrible, we need to pass the costs on to our customers. Historically, when you look back about 7 years later, they were mostly dead. You can't pass costs on to other people, they just didn't work. Right? The people who instead said, this is a fantastic opportunity to innovate and absorb all these things, be much clever, and offer something new, they all survived and prospered. So there's a mindset issue on that.
By the way, the Romans were world record holders of deforestation at the time.
Absolutely. And that helped a lot.
This is good. We'll make this quick, and a quick response, gentlemen, please, and then we'll get one more in and then we'll wrap.
Thank you very much. Roger Carthew from Carthew Corporation. I run a small business. I'd like to pick up on the point from Herbie about the importance of a culture of sustainability. In my own small business, I've discovered when I began to go down the path of building sustainable credentials that my customers didn't give us stuff. Okay? And so please, I want to hear what plans are in place for education, for building a sustainable culture in this country, because it won't happen otherwise. Mr. Premier, you would understand politically you can only go as far as your electorate will allow you.
Well, one of the things that I was saying when I told the two stories, which is about container deposit legislation and plastic bags, that I was incredibly surprised by the 90% figure. Politicians don't see 90%. We don't operate on that. We operate on 51% or 50.1%.
Ceausescu did.
That's true. That's true. And the thing is that there was some polling done in 2009 that showed that the thing that South Australians were most proud of was actually what we were doing in renewable energy. And of course we've seen a greater take-up here in terms of solar, not just wind, but solar panels as well. So, and it's interesting that we've signed with Stephen Schneider's recommendations for the first climate change legislation in Australia, which was here. And the voluntary agreements were set up. There's other things, including the targets that we, on renewables and so on. But so many companies are signing up with us, and industry groups and regions, because not only is it the right thing to do, but they also believe that it's positive for them economically. And I should just give you one example, the wine industry. Wine industry was the first industry group to sign up to a climate change or a CO2 emissions reduction strategy. Now, why? Well, because when we were at the London Wine Show, the big wine buyers were telling us that what the public of Britain wanted, and they're the biggest buyers of our wine, was obviously about quality of the wine, the price of the wine, the character of the region and the character of the winemakers, but also how many carbon miles were being, and so if the winemakers could demonstrate that they're also clean and green, then that was a real marketing edge. And the South Australian wine industry has been the first in the world to really embrace that. And I think that's not just good for the environment, it's also smart business.
Just 30 seconds here. Oh no, Fred, I'm changing culture.
A friend of mine drew a diagram recently which was two axes, vertical and horizontal. Vertical was time, horizontal was space. And most people live right in the corner, very close by time-wise and very close by space-wise. And the problem that we have today is that most of our impacts are somewhere out there globally, with ecological footprints being far out there. And it is still an enormous challenge to make the link between these two things. And the media clearly are a major issue in this context. I spent 15 years being a documentary filmmaker, looking at environmental issues. We were constantly competing with advertising, with all kinds of wonderful entertainment. Of course, I love watching movies like everybody else as well. No, not so much Blade Runner, perhaps, but anyway, so certainly the reality is that we are constantly being driven to live in this here and now world. And that, I think, has not really been challenged sufficiently, despite the fact that, of course, all the kind of initiatives that you talk about are beginning to cause mindsets to take place, but not enough and not fast enough.
Look, I'm going to have to move us on from that, Fred, unless you're desperate to respond. This gentleman's got the last question. Sir?
My name's Peter Nichols. I run a small lifestyle business called Work Leisure, but my long-term background is recreation planning. The one finite thing in a long-term planning is land. How do you see we are going to ensure that we continue to have adequate areas of open space, particularly given the increasing pressure on land values and costs and pressures for space?
Fred Hansen, do you want to start that one?
Well, I mean, it seems to me that in this setting, you need to be able to be very clear on what you're going to protect and what is potentially for development. And I think that we first have to realize that we cannot waste a limited resource in terms of land mass and just expect that we can kind of continue to be able to just kind of expand and without much regard. to it. I think that's why a non-porous urban growth boundary within the Adelaide area is very, very important, and I stress the words non-porous. Secondly, I think that it really is important that the infrastructure around that really encourages different alternatives. And then to be able to be clear that in the areas that are protected, that there aren't kind of little places that you kind of let something slip through. The test in my community about whether it's successful is if you're looking at the land values on one side of that urban growth boundary, are they land values that are associated with development, the potential for higher cost land? And is the other side really at agricultural prices or not? If there isn't much distinction, people are concluding that you're not very serious about that land distinction and that it will really evaporate. If they are serious, if the price differentials are great, as they are in my community, then it says you can hold that over time.
Just quickly, Herbie.
Just a very quick one. I mean, I agree with Fred, of course, about the importance of global urban growth boundaries, but we must also realize that the ecological footprints of our cities today extend across the entire planet. I mean, we live in our cities on 3 or 4% of the world's land surface, but the actual land surfaces, you know, in terms of food production, in terms of timber supply, in terms of carbon sequestration, are global. So I think we need to bust the concept of land in those terms to make sure that we really have an understanding of these global linkages that relate directly to our very local lifestyles.
Just quickly, just last week, John Roos introduced legislation to protect the McLaren Vale area and from urban encroachment, and also the Barossa Valley. And the legislation is very tough in terms of, you know, retail developments and other developments. I think that, and that really again came out of this distillation of what Fred was saying and also what Herbie was saying about footprints, but it's also about making sure that the unique character and values of the Barossa and McLaren Vale aren't completely wiped out by becoming extensions of the suburbs. And people like Maggie Beer and Pip Forrester and Peter Lehman and Margaret Lehman had a real influence on this and should be commended. Citizen action.
Thank you very much, and sadly we're not going to have a chance to have that conversation about citizen action, which would have been great. Can you put your hands together to thank our guests, please?